Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording, and then I think we will get started. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all here. This is our Information Literacy Virtual Workshop series. This is the first workshop in the series, and the topic today will be on scholarship as conversation. So really quickly, my name is Jane Hammonds, and I am an assistant professor in the university libraries. I am the teaching and learning engagement librarian. So my role is to think about ways to integrate information literacy into the curriculum. My email is hammonds.73@osu.edu. If you have any questions or comments after the workshop, please feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to talk more about information literacy. I want to take a quick moment to thank Stephanie Founds, one of my colleagues who has graciously agreed to help today, and she will be monitoring the chat. So I did want to let everyone know, so you are automatically muted, but you feel free to share any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and Stephanie will be monitoring that throughout, and we'll be stopping at different places throughout the workshop to take a look at the chat and answer any questions or comments that you might have. I also want to apologize in case one of my dogs starts barking or my cat jumps up in front of me. One of the casualties of doing workshops from home. So what are we doing today? The focus of the workshop will be on providing a basic description of the scholarship as conversation frame as it is presented in the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. We will be talking about some possible student learning bottlenecks that may be related to scholarship as conversation. And we'll be thinking about some strategies, activities, or assignments that might be helpful in encouraging students to develop an understanding of this concept or to prepare to engage in scholarly conversations in their fields. So I'd like to take just a minute before we jump in and ask you to think about what comes to mind when you hear the phrase scholarship as conversation or the scholarly conversation. And if you'd like to share a few thoughts on that in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. If you'd rather just keep it to yourself, that's fine as well. But we'll give just a minute to have everyone just think a little bit about scholarship as conversation and what that might mean to them. So we had one comment of scholarship as reading conversation. Okay, so as we go forward, I'll ask you to keep in mind what you thought about when you thought about scholarship as conversation, and think about how that compares to scholarship as conversation as we will be talking about it. So a couple other conversations: sharing ideas with peers in an academic manner, conversation between scholars, exchange of ideas with a scholarly bent, yeah, an open dialogue between people publishing ideas. My field rhetoric teaches it this way: as an unending conversation, you enter not knowing much, listening, and then eventually contributing, which will go on after you leave it. You agree, disagree, expand upon it. Great, yeah, so thank you all for sharing those thoughts about how you think about scholarship as conversation. So we'll go in ahead and move forward and jump into this a little bit more. So scholarship as conversation is one of 6 core information literacy concepts that are outlined in a document called the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. The Framework for Information Literacy was developed by the Association of College and Research Libraries in 2015 as a way to provide an updated and expanded definition of information literacy. Previous definitions of information literacy had been very skill-based. So a student was information literate if they were able to find, evaluate, and use information. That was sort of the core of information literacy. The framework presents a conceptual understanding of information literacy. So it's not just about what our students are able to do, but what students understand. And the framework holds that there are core concepts that expert researchers, expert scholars understand about information, about how information is created, about how it's accessed, about how it's shared, about how it's valued. That experts understand these core concepts, but novices, so students, may not understand. And this sort of gap in understanding could be the reason for a lot of the misunderstandings or frustrations that are experienced between students and instructors when it comes to research or inquiry-based assignments or assignments that require them to use information sources. So the framework presents this idea that without a really strong grasp on these core underlying concepts, a lot of the things that we ask students to do related to research and scholarship may not really make much sense to them. So they may be able to do things but not really understand why. So an example would be using scholarly journal articles in their papers. Students may use these because they're told that they have to use scholarly journal articles, but they may not really understand why. What's the process involved in creating these sources? What is the peer review process? And why do their instructors consider those sources to be more authoritative than other sources? Right? So this view of information literacy is that it's not just about what students can do, but it's also about what students understand about information and about how information is created, accessed, shared, valued. So the framework outlines 6 core concepts that we think students need to grasp in order to really be able to effectively engage with information and develop their skills as researchers and scholars. So to provide a quick overview of this concept, hopefully this video will work. It's only about 1 minute and 30 seconds, but this just gives a good overview of what we're thinking about when we think about scholarship as conversation. So we'll go ahead and play this. Hopefully this will work.
For his history class, Deshaun has to write a research paper on the causes of World War II. He bases most of his argument on a single book. After reading the rough draft, his professor tells him that before he relies so much on this one book, he needs to look at other books and articles on the topic.
Yep, sorry. Jump.
Most of his argument on a single book. After reading the rough draft, his professor tells him that before he relies so much on this one book, he needs to look at other books and articles on the topic. As he does so, Deshaun realizes that most other historians actually disagree with the conclusions made by the author of the first book. He even finds some articles where other historians specifically point out the problems they see with the book he was using. In this situation, Deshaun is coming to understand the concept of scholarship as conversation. At first, he did not understand that the book he found was not the final word on the topic. But as he read the additional books and articles, he came to see that his book was part of an ongoing debate that historians have been having on the topic, and that it represented only one perspective. He was surprised to realize that historians do not always agree. Instead, for many topics, there is not one clear answer that everyone accepts. As he comes to understand the scholarly conversation, Deshaun realizes that he cannot determine the value of any particular information source until he understands the broader conversation that is taking place around that source.
So hopefully you all were able to see and hear that. But I like to start with that just as a quick little overview and introduction and thinking about what this might mean from the perspective of a student and not really understanding this idea of scholarship as conversation. So to jump into it a little bit more, As we already discussed a little bit in the comments, scholarship as conversation is this idea that researchers, scholars, professionals within particular fields or disciplines are engaging in these ongoing discussions and debates through their work, so through their publications, through their presentations, and they're presenting their findings, they're making their arguments, and they're having these discussions where they challenge each other, they debate, they discuss. Some ideas are accepted, some ideas are rejected, and that these conversations have been going on for a long time and are continuing to go on and will continue to go on. Through this process, there have been cases, there are topics for which generally accepted answers have been established, but in a lot of cases there are not, and there continue to be these multiple and competing perspectives for any topic or question. So any source that you have represents basically only one voice in this conversation, and cannot be seen to represent the whole of the conversation. Or the whole perspective of everyone in the field on that particular topic. So experts understand that these conversations are taking place. They know where to go to find the conversations in their field. They know where to find the conversations on their topic. They know how to navigate the conversations. They know how to engage with the conversations. They know they're expected to, as scholars, as researchers, to engage with other scholars. For many students, however, this can be a really new idea and a very different way of thinking about research, inquiry-based projects, and what their role in that might be. So the framework outlines specific knowledge practices or behaviors or actions and ways of thinking that students need to start developing as they start to grasp this concept of scholarship as conversation. I'm just going to highlight a few of those. There's actually many more of these in the framework itself, but I just wanted to highlight a few of them right now. So students, as they're developing their information literacy, start to recognize that they're entering into this ongoing conversation, that it's not a finished conversation. And they start to recognize the importance of thinking about, it's hard to determine the value of this one particular source if I don't understand this broader context, if I don't really know the previous discussion that has been taking place. And it's really important for students to start to understand that if they want to enter the conversation, they're going to have certain things that they need to do, certain responsibilities that they have. So students, as they are developing their information literacy, will start learning how to identify the contribution that particular sources might be making to the conversation. They'll learn to recognize that that scholarly perspective can change over time. And that the way scholars thought about a particular topic in the 1950s or 60s may not be the way that it's thought about today. And so being able to see how that perspective has changed over time. Coming to see that citations is one of those responsibilities that they have in entering this conversation. And coming to think about citations as providing that record of that conversation in their own work. It's also really important, and one of the things we often really want students to do is to start to think of themselves as being capable of contributing to these kinds of conversations. And this is really challenging. This is very intimidating. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who even now when I go to publish something thinks, what do I possibly have to contribute that would be of any value to this conversation? And then if you think about that from the perspective of a student who's just learning and just entering this field, how hard it is to start putting your own voice out there and making your own arguments. So it's really difficult to start learning to think of yourself as, a scholar or a scholar in training and as someone who has something to contribute to the conversations. Right? One of the reasons why it's so hard to really start thinking of yourself in that way is that really you're required to basically learn a different language, learn a new language in order to be able to participate. Like it's like you walk into a party and everyone else is speaking a different language that you don't know. And so you can't just jump into the conversation until you have that time where you can, okay, learn, okay, yeah, here's what research in this field looks like. Here's what evidence in this field looks like. Here's how sources are cited in this field. Here's what the writing style is in this field. So before you can really jump in and start to contribute as a student, there's a lot you have to learn about the discipline and, you know, learning really to speak that language of that particular field. So just to really quick sum up, scholarship as conversation is this concept that scholars, researchers are engaging in these ongoing debates and discussions. The sources that are representing different voices in this ongoing conversation, but might not be the final word. And although students can participate in this conversation and often are expected to be learning how to participate in this conversation, this can be a really difficult process and they have to learn the language of that field first. So where might students struggle? They might struggle first to just recognize that these conversations are actually taking place. This idea of a scholarly conversation might be really new to students. They might even, once they start to understand that conversations are going on, where do they go to find the conversations in their field or the conversation on their topic? Which sources are the ones that are going to be the ones that they need to look at for their particular topic? And then the challenge of thinking of themselves as capable of contributing to the conversation. So I want to take a minute here and just a sec and see if there are any questions. Check the time to see where I'm at. So if you do have any questions or comments to share at the moment, we'll give a couple minutes for that and then we'll go on. Sorry. And of course, I'm sorry, my dogs have started barking as expected. Will I share the PowerPoint with us later? Yes, everyone will get an email with the PowerPoint and links to additional information. And thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie added a link to the Framework for Information Literacy in the chat. If anyone wants to go and take a look at that, the full document. And of course, my dogs are actually going crazy right now. So if we're gonna hold on 1 second, I am so sorry about this. Normally they don't go that mad. I'm going to grab them real quick. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead. Doesn't look like we have any other questions, so we'll go ahead and move on. And for this next part, I'd like you to just, we're gonna think about your experiences with students so far and any challenges or frustrations that you think might be attributed to or might be related to this concept and the fact that students may not really have understood this idea of a scholarly conversation. So, or you can think about it in a different way and think about once students really get this concept, what will make sense to them? What kinds of things will they understand that maybe they didn't before? So what types of assignments might make sense to them? So take a few minutes to reflect on that yourself. If you have any thoughts that you would like to share, you can go ahead and share those in the chat. And then we'll move on to the next section and try to think more deeply about this issue. So we'll give it just a minute. So we have one comment from Peggy. One challenge for me is that students don't have the language. They want to say in the simplest conversations, right? So yeah, keeping it really simple instead of jumping into those meatier pieces because they don't really have that understanding of the language that they need. Absolutely. And just by the way, everyone is automatically muted, but you can always share your conversations in the chat. So, couple other comments. So come up with your own topic idea, then produce an annotated bibliography of scholars speaking from different perspectives on it. And one challenge, how many sources do you want? Yes. Annotated bibliography assignments definitely are challenging related to this concept. And so students focus on just the number of sources that they need. Do you think that introducing this concept in 2367 writing courses is at the right level, or should we introduce this in more advanced courses? I think it's actually a good idea to introduce this very early. Even if we don't expect students to start engaging with the conversations early on, just having them start learning to think about research and scholarship in this way, I think could be very helpful to students. Students may be accustomed to reading website articles. It takes more time and effort to research the body of academic literature's terminology, concepts. Yeah, definitely is more challenging to engage, even just to understand the conversation that has been taking place. Great, thank you all for sharing those comments. So we'll go ahead and building on that, start thinking about some of the challenges that might be related to this concept, or the student learning bottlenecks that might be related. Sorry about that. If you're not familiar with the phrase student learning bottlenecks, it just really quickly refers to those places within the research process where a lot of students tend to get stuck. So if we think of research as an ongoing process, where are those parts where you see a lot of students really struggling? And I think that there may be a lot of bottlenecks related to the concept of scholarship as conversation. So, and this was mentioned already in the chat a little bit, but research questions. One of the most common things that we ask students to do is to develop a research question. And as we become more and more engaged in our own field, integrated in our own field, I think it can become more and more difficult for us to see how hard it is to develop a research question you don't know the conversation that has been taking place, right? If you don't, first of all, understand that this conversation has been taking place, or you don't know what the previous conversation has been, how do you know what questions have already been asked? How do you know what questions haven't yet been answered? So how do you know what the areas of disagreement are that represent gaps where you can develop a research question that you can try to fill? So it can be really, really challenging to develop a really good research question if you're not already familiar with the conversations that have been taking place on the topic. Locating sources, we already mentioned this one as well, but students may be familiar with how to use databases or how to use search engines, but they may not know where to go to find the conversations that have been taking place on their topic. You know, are there specific journals? Are there specific databases or websites? So what are those venues, those conversational venues? As I know, as a librarian, I've often seen students who are using a database that is just a completely wrong database for their topic. You know, they're using JSTOR, but they really need to be using CINAHL. But they're not familiar with this idea that these conversations are taking place in multiple different places, and they have to find the right way to engage with the conversation in their area. Source evaluation. This is one that was we saw in the video that we watched. It's really important to identify the relevance of particular sources if we don't know what that conversation has been. You know, what are the seminal sources in this particular field or on this topic? Which sources have been rejected? Why have those sources been rejected? So identifying the value or the relevance of any one particular source can be really challenging if we don't know that conversation that has been taking place. Citations. We all know that students have so much anxiety and frustration and even hostility around citations. And part of that, I think, is because, you know, they see citations as something that's being imposed on them, a requirement that they have to do, instead of thinking about citations the way that scholars think about citations. As, you know, here's the record of this conversation that's been taking place. When I'm citing sources, I'm showing other people that this is the conversation that I'm engaging in. These are the other scholars that I'm talking to in my work. And so including those citations is a way of showing that conversation and showing my place in that conversation. And so I think developing a better understanding of this concept might really help students to really think about why they're required to include citations in a different way. Really quickly, just some other bottlenecks. One of the things we often see in library world is students want one source, that one perfect source that is going to answer every question that they have and just going to completely cover the entire topic. And, you know, that doesn't really work if we're thinking about scholarship as conversation, because that one source is only going to represent one perspective or one voice. And so this requirement that you have to include multiple sources and can't just go to one source can be a challenge. Why are there no right answers? This is something we see a lot too, in that, you know, source A says this and source B says this and source C says this, and what is the right answer? Students want to be correct, you know, they want the right answer, and it's really difficult at times for students to accept this idea that there may not be a one accepted right answer on this topic. And then summary instead of synthesis. So basically, a lot of students, especially when they think about research projects that they've done in high school, you know, the goal of research was to summarize sources on a topic. And so they may not recognize that what their instructor wants them to do is to be, you know, synthesizing sources and then going further, you know, making their own argument, adding their own opinion. You know, getting students to start putting their perspective in there can be a real challenge, because they want to be, as we said, they want to be right. They want to know what the right answer is. And so all of these can be really difficult areas for students that I think are related to not really having a good grasp on this idea of scholarship as conversation. So I wanted to take another break there to see if there are any additional questions or comments before we go further. Source evaluation is becoming even trickier now that there's more pre-publication stuff online. Comment from Peggy, yes, definitely. So many different versions of things are available out there that it can be very confusing. The sheer number of journals online also confuses students, absolutely. And especially this idea that, you know, everything, because we tend to find everything online, it all looks the same. So it may be an academic journal article, but we found it online the same as a blog post or a news article. So we don't see the physical differences between sources anymore. Yeah, so that comment came through from Megan. My students seem to have a lot of problems identifying different sources. They treat many different types of sources as websites since they never even see a print version. So yeah, exactly. In the library world, we talk about that as container collapse. This idea that there's no longer any containers that we actually physically see, and so everything tends to end up looking the same. Another comment, I really like the course-based research guides that the library has put together for students to know which databases they should look at for X or Y conversation. So yeah, thank you for raising that point. So anyone that is not aware, the library does provide research guides for topics, as well as in certain cases, certain courses. that provide specific guidance on where to go to search for that particular topic or in that discipline. Peggy shared, I have had good luck using Cornell University Library's 90-second videos on substantive news versus scholarly articles to help students get the difference, supplemented with my own examples. Thank you for sharing that, Peggy. I'm actually not aware of those videos, but I will go look for them later. So I think we'll go ahead and jump into the next section. And again, I wanted to have us take a minute to think about where the conversations in our own field take place. You know, where do we go to find those? Who are the participants in those conversations? In what types of sources do those conversations appear? And I think even more importantly, how did you learn that? How did you learn where to go to find these conversations? So I'll let you all have a minute to reflect on that. And then we'll move into the next section, thinking about some different strategies or activities that we might use to help students start to develop their knowledge of these areas. So when we think about how we might be able to start teaching this concept to students, I'm going to very quickly go through some potential activities or assignments that might be useful. I won't have a time to go in depth on each of those, but I will be sharing with everyone a link to all the workshop materials, and you'll be able to find a folder and box with more detailed versions of all of these assignments. So I'm just going to give a high level overview now, but you will be able to access full versions of the assignments after. See, one more chat question. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Peggy shared the link to the news article. So thank you very much for that, Peggy. Yeah. Monica shared, in my class, we discussed how to engage with the public as well, which is, yeah, definitely hard, especially with scientific topics. Right, so how can we help students start to develop their understanding of this concept? So my first sort of recommendation is, more in terms of strategy, is basically just starting really small. I know that some of you might be familiar with the book Small Teaching by James Lang, which really talks about this idea that even really small instructional interventions can have an important impact on student learning. So I like to recommend really just starting a conversation with your students about this concept, because it is, as we said, it is something that in a lot of cases, no one is ever told explicitly that this is happening. It's something that we often expect students to figure out on their own. Like, I don't remember anyone ever telling me that scholars were having conversations, right? It was something that, as my background before I became a librarian was history, and it was like, oh, okay, you know, it kind of is something that sinks in over time. And although there's nothing really wrong with that, I think it does account for some of the frustrations that students might experience, that we never really explicitly talk about this to them and never really explain that this is what is going on. And so I think that just starting small and having a discussion with your students, so very similar to what we did at the beginning of the workshop, just having them take a couple of minutes and reflect, you know, have you ever heard of this idea of the scholarly conversation? What do you think that that might mean? You know, who do you think that might be involved in those kinds of conversations? What do you think the role might be in that? You know, if you are giving students a research project, you know, maybe this could be one of the early discussions that you have when you're talking about that project, to get them thinking about, you know, here's how you view research and here's what your expectations are. and get them thinking, oh, this is about joining a conversation rather than just compiling information on this topic. A very similar activity could be just a simple true-false activity. I've used this a lot with students where I'll just give them 5 or 6 statements and have them think about those statements. You know, do I think this is true? Do I think this is false? Is this something that I'm not really familiar with at all? And it offers a really good discussion. So the example that I've given here is a statement that I've used with students, and just each source can be considered a voice in a conversation among scholars, and have them think about, do you think that's true or false? What do I mean when I'm saying that? And so it just leads to some interesting discussions with students about how we think about sources as scholars compared to maybe how they have been thinking about sources. Another really quick activity that you could do, you could show students the video that we used earlier in the class, or I've also added some links to additional videos there that I'll share with everyone that provide really good quick summaries for students of getting them started thinking about scholarship as conversation. So, you know, showing one of those videos, having them write a quick response, doing a quick little discussion on what that means, just as a way to start them thinking about what their role might be in joining a scholarly conversation and what the expectations are. So a little bit more detailed ideas for assignments or activities. Could have students do some type of activity where they need to visualize or show, you know, the scholarly conversation on a particular topic. So creating a concept map or some kind of chart or timeline where they take a bunch of sources on the same research question and figure out a way to visualize or show the connections between those sources. So it could be, you know, something where there's one source in the center and they have lots of lines going out to different other sources, showing the connections to those sources. Just as a way to get them to recognize that these sources are all connected to each other, that none of them stands in isolation, but you know, this source is citing these 3 other sources and that source is citing this one over here, and, you know, creating those connections or seeing that web of sources together on that conversation. A very similar kind of activity, one that I've done with students before, is giving them one source on a topic, and, you know, say the source is maybe 5 years old. And I would ask them to say, do you think that this author was the first person to ever look at this topic? And they're generally like, no, probably not. And then I'll ask them, okay, well, how do you find out who else has been talking about this topic? How do you find out what previous people have thought about this topic? And they'll generally say, oh, if you look at the citations, you'll find that. And so we have them look at the citations and just say, you know, ask them questions about those citations. What's the oldest source that you find cited there? What's the most recent source that you find cited? See any journals that are cited multiple times in the reference list? Do you see any scholars that might be cited more than once? You know, what might it mean if you see the same journal being cited over and over again? And you could have them continue to go back, pick one of those citations and find the citations for that source, and kind of so that they can see that going back, it's this ongoing process. Then I would return to the original source and say, okay, so this source is 5 years old. Do you think that this author was the last person to talk about this topic? And they'll say, no, probably not, right? And you say, you know, how do you figure out who else has been talking about this since this topic was, this source was published? And this is really a great place to show them. I always would use Google Scholar with this. Google Scholar has the great option of allowing you to see the cited by sources. So entering a source and then seeing who has cited that source. And so using this as a way to see backward and forward that this one source that they found is not the final word. It's not the first word on the topic, and it's not the final word on that topic. So there's an example of activity that I've used multiple times with students, and it's always worked really well. Acting out the conversation. This one I think is really, especially if you have a topic where there's really clearly defined schools of thought on that topic. As I said, my background was in history. before I became a librarian. And so I used to do this kind of activity with students on the causes of World War I, because there's been some very clear schools of thought on what the causes were. And I would assign each student one particular voice to represent or a perspective to represent, and have them do a debate about the different perspectives. Another possible activity, and this is one that's looking at things in a slightly different way. As we mentioned, even if students understand that the conversations are taking place, they may not really know where to go to find those conversations. So creating some sort of map or chart that basically highlights the venues for conversation in this particular field or on this topic. You know, where are the databases that we need to be looking at? What journals, what conferences would I want to look at if I wanted to present on this topic? So helping them create sort of a visual representation of, you know, where those conversations are actually taking place. Another potential activity could be some type of group literature review. We often ask students to do literature reviews or annotated bibliography assignments, but doing this as a group could be very helpful. So assigning each student or each group of students one source to review, but creating a document, for example, a shared document, where each student adds their source to that list, and then looking at it as a whole, having each student write a summary of what the conversation has been based on what they see on those different sources. That would be another way to get them to understand what the purpose of a literature review article literature review might be, and to start to understand the conversation that has been taking place about that topic. Just checking the time real quick to make sure I'm not running over. A few more minutes. And then one last example, again, this is looking at it from a slightly different perspective, but especially if you have students who you really want to start engaging in conversations, for example, like presenting at a conference or submitting to an undergraduate research journal, having them think about the etiquette or the guidelines for entering that conversation. So, you know, what are the rules, the citation styles, what are the writing conventions that you need to be aware of in this? So having them work together to kind of create the etiquettes so they're prepared as they start to try to enter into the conversations. So those are my examples of some of the ways that we might start helping students to develop a better understanding of this concept or start preparing them to enter the conversations in their field. So I know that there's been some comments in the chat. I'll go and check that. And then you can also, as you're thinking, if there are ways that you have been teaching this concept or ways that you would like to teach this concept, go ahead and share those in the chat, and we will take a look at that. So taking a look at the chat, Carrie asked, to the beginning writing courses at OSU walk through the peer review process for journals? Peggy responded, yes, we talked about that in English 1110 at ATI. I love the citation chaining idea from Peggy. Great. Yeah, I think it's a really fun activity I've done with students before. And it also, they're always really excited to learn about the Cite It By feature for Google Scholar, and this idea that you can go forward in time and see how the conversation has continued is always one that goes over really well. So recommendation for the true-false question: each participant's research, including your own, can be a voice in the conversation. Yeah, that's a great, great potential revision to that question, so that you're already getting them to think about the idea that they have their own voice that they can insert into the conversation. Absolutely. Peggy Lindsay has shared, I really like John. I'm gonna just say, I'm not gonna even attempt to that last name.
Hey, Jane, I think you froze there for a moment.
And his use of terms in scholarly versus wait. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, I am getting a notice that the internet connection is unstable. So sorry about that. Of course, that has to happen today. That hasn't happened since I've been working from home. Let's see. So yeah, Peggy referenced A Reader's Guide to College Writing as a great resource. Brian Ritchie shares, I have the subject librarian give a presentation on how to search for sources. That's a great recommendation, Brian. And yeah, librarians are often very happy to work with you, with your students to help start developing better understandings of these concepts. I like the etiquette idea. I could see starting the term with using that for email versus text versus social media and expanding it into research readings. Yeah, that's a great idea, Peggy. Even just how to communicate with their instructors through email can be challenging for students. So Nick shared, I made a simulated debate on Carmen using a choose your own adventure format with pages, including a source for the objecting view and tasking students to find an outside resource to support their counter arguments. Yeah, I love that idea. Shared, I have examples of the same research written up in popular magazines, substantive news and scholarly to show the difference and ask them to try to find the same. Yeah, I think that's a great example of an assignment, Peggy, as see how the same research findings can be presented in multiple different ways depending on who the audience is, right? And that helps them think too about, you know, their own writing and who's my audience, and when I'm writing for a scholarly audience, I need to be writing differently than if I was writing for a popular magazine. Absolutely. Another comment, I generally teach 11:10 around a particular theme and then let students choose their own variation on it so that they can create together a class document of possible sources, each responsible for finding annotated several, then group those sources into perspectives, and each student can choose specific sources from the class doc to develop their own conversation. That is a great idea. I love that assignment. I love the idea of giving students that help. I think one of the things that is we expect a lot out of students sometimes without often really giving them the scaffolding that they need to be able to do that. And part of that is not really, it's just that once we become experts in our field, it becomes really, really challenging for us to see things from the perspective of a student. So things that seem very natural and normal to us may be completely new to students. And so doing that kind of assignment that gives them that assistance, I think is really helpful. So we have a few more minutes to go. If there's any other thoughts or comments that you would like to share, you can go ahead and add those into the chat. Any questions that you might have. Let's see. So as I mentioned, I am going to make all of the workshop materials available to everyone. So I'll send a follow-up email with a link where you can go to access the materials as well as sample assignments and activities. And that also includes, there's like a self-guided version of this workshop where you can develop an assignment or activity or expand on one that you already use to teach this concept. You're not required at all, of course, to do the self-guided aspect, but if you are interested in that, that is available to you as well. So Stephanie has shared in the chat the link to the self-guided workshop materials, as well as information on the upcoming workshops in this series. So this is a 6-part workshop. So each workshop will cover one of those 6 concepts, core concepts that we discuss. And the next workshop will be on research as inquiry. So, and I will also put that up here on the screen as well. So each of the workshops will take place on Thursdays at noon. So up through July 2nd, I believe, is the last one. And you can attend as many of them or as few of them as you would like. So if you'd like to attend all of them, that's great. If not, and there's only specific topics that you find interested, that is fine as well. I did also want to mention that if you're interested in sort of a deeper dive into information literacy, we do offer a teaching information literacy endorsement that you can, it's available through the University Institute for Teaching and Learning. And I included the link to that there. That is a self-paced, fully online course that's available through Carmen Canvas. That's designed to take between 10 and 12 hours to complete. There is no specific time limit, so once you get started, it is completely self-paced. And if you do finish that course, you will develop an literacy action plan for integrating information literacy into a course. And once you've completed that, you can apply to receive the teaching information literacy endorsement from UITL. So if anyone's interested in that, just let me know. We'll go ahead and check in the chat again. So yeah, Stephanie put the link for that in there as well. Brian asked, how do we expect scholarship as conversation to change in the future as all things become online and modes of communication change? That I think is a really great question. Part of it will be in terms of it's in some ways a lot easier for people to participate in conversations, which is great and also challenging as everyone has more of a chance to share their voice. Determining which voices to trust become more and more challenging. That also has sort of a different aspect in that although for most people there will be increased access, for a lot of people still there will not be that access. As things become more and more online, some people are going to be cut off from the conversation. Those that don't really have great access to information technology or broadband internet access may not be able to engage and participate in those ongoing conversations as other people have done. So that's a really great question. And I think, I don't know if I could give a really great answer at this point in terms of how things will change, but I think my perspective is that it becomes harder and harder to really know who to listen to and know what sources may be considered authoritative. When we had print journals, it was easy to point to, here's this print journal and this, is something physical that you can point to as a solid source. Whereas since everything is out there online and, how do we know what's peer reviewed and not? I think it becomes more difficult. That's my perspective, and anyone else would be welcome to share as well if they have ideas about how they think that scholarship as conversation might change. Pandemic is a great example of that whole issue. Yes, so much information, Peggy, out there. And what do we trust? What do we know? How do we determine who the experts are, who has the authority to actually speak on this topic? So I think that we are definitely coming to the end of our time together. I want to thank you all for coming and for participating today. If you do have any questions or problems, again, concepts or concerns, issues, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to continue talking about this. Carrie added, I've seen people refer to the amount of information on COVID as an infodemic too. Oh, I've never heard that term. That's really interesting, Carrie. Thank you. Yeah. All right, so again, thank you all for coming. I hope to see you all at the next workshop next Thursday, where we're going to be talking about research as inquiry. And you'll all be getting a follow-up email soon with all of the links and everything for today. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks, Brian, Saida. It was wonderful to see all of you. Go ahead. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your help sharing all those links. And I
You're
think I'm
welcome.
ready to go ahead and end the meeting. So it seems like I still have a few people in here, but if you all have any additional questions, please feel free to let me know. Go ahead and